Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Forests as preventative medicine, our first line of defense against disease. Presented by WWF Manager for Forests, Annika Terrana. It is wonderful to have you with us today, Annika. I'm going to hand things off to you.
Great, thank you so very much for having me, and hello everyone. I'm really pleased to be here. As Kendall said, my name's Annika Terrana, and I am with the World Wildlife Fund. I've been with WWF for just over 8 years now within our forest team, and for most of that specifically, I've worked on our corporate engagement efforts to work with companies on their impact on forests. So both really minimizing any harm that is done from forest products, especially wood, pulp, paper, onto forests, but also the power of the private sector to really change the trajectory of our impact on forests and value them for all that they do provide. And I am especially grateful to be here because this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart and quite central to my background before WWF, where I lived and worked in Western Kenya on Mfungano Island in Lake Victoria. You can see here on the screen, this is me and my friend Walter looking up to the top of this plateau on Mfungano, looking at the daunting climb ahead. A few hours later, we were on top of that mountain. But this is a really important place in the world, but it was also really important to me. It's an area where HIV prevalence is over 30%, and it's where I first saw firsthand really the pitfalls of addressing a disease like HIV medically only, without really understanding all the other factors and the broader context that goes into contributing to the rise of HIV, but also where I really saw the inverse, where friends and community leaders really took charge of their own health, in part by placing local deforestation and unsustainable fishing practices really at the center of their own approach to strengthening their own community. And so deforestation has played a role on Mfungano in numerous ways, and it's interacted with HIV in numerous ways, one of which being because with the increase of HIV, people were no longer able to do the more labor-intensive traditional farming work that they had done for generations, in which they used terracing on these very steep slopes of Mfungano. And in turn, with the rise of HIV, they turned to much less labor-intensive practices of slash and burn. There were fewer people who could do the farming, and slash and burn was easier to clear more land. But really, where this story starts is not encroachment into the forests of Mfungano, but instead encroachment into forests much farther inland in Central Africa a few decades ago, that resulted in the emergence and spread of HIV. And I'm going to go into more about how that's the case and why that started so long ago within Central Africa and then expanded into HIV, or into Mfungano in East Africa. But first, I think it's really important when we talk about what are the impacts of deforestation to really understand all the benefits that come with forests, healthy forests that are indeed just standing. So firstly, they're essential to life on Earth. They cover over a third of all land area, and they are critical to purifying the air that we breathe. They filter the water that we drink, and they help significantly to prevent erosion. You might if you know anything about kind of those deep root systems that forests can provide, you might have thought on those steep slopes where there's slash and burn on Mfungano, there was an increase in landslides because of that deforestation. So forests really act as that buffer against that, and they act as a key buffer against climate change, given that they store up to 60% of the world's living terrestrial carbon. They also harbor much of the world's rapidly diminishing biodiversity. They're home to more than 3/4 of life on land. That is significant. most of the world's terrestrial biodiversity do depend directly on forests. And it's not just wildlife, people as well. More than 1 billion people depend directly on forests for their survival. Worldwide, over 750 million people live in forests, of whom 60 million are indigenous people. And on top of that, there are countless more people that depend on forest products for their livelihoods, for local markets and trade. And the global economies also depend on forests. $500 billion in annual global trade of forest products alone, and that's really more conventional forest products. When we think about solid wood and pulp and paper products, that doesn't include the many non-timber forest products that are consumed informally and locally and form the backbone of a lot of local economies. But within that number, we really don't do a whole lot on accounting for all of the services that forests provide to people's health. Evidence really strongly indicates that forests impact human health in many ways. And here's just a few of those ways: non-communicable disease, communicable disease, nutrition and food security, environmental exposure, and natural hazards, among others. These are broad-based categories of human health that have direct relationships with healthy forests. So nutrition and food security, for example, malnutrition in all its forms costs society an estimated $3.5 trillion per year. And some of that is related to soil quality, that's related to forests and the compromising of forest provisioning services to better soil and maintaining micronutrients that exist within forests. A lot of local communities depend directly on standing forests for those micronutrients. So we hear a lot in food security realm about protein. We hear less about the minerals and vitamins that we also need that are really critical to long-term health, especially to children's development. And communities that live closer to forests tend to have better nutrition, better health in areas where they don't have access to the broad range of services that we might, those of us that live in cities. So these two kids are part of a family that have a farm on the outskirts of a massive national park in Colombia, and they rely on their farm and the good soil and the nutrients right near this large national park for their improved resilience and health based on those services that neighboring forests provide. But I want to talk a little bit more today about communicable disease. We've heard a lot about this category of implications for people, certainly of late because of COVID-19. When we say communicable disease, we mean the broad range of infectious diseases that affect people. And the majority of those come actually originally from wildlife. They're called zoonotic diseases. It includes infectious diseases that are novel, like COVID-19, that have spilled over from animals to humans. But it also includes infectious diseases that rely on vectors like ticks and mosquitoes, vector-borne diseases that are expanding because of climate change, which is allowing them to have much wider and changed ranges of habitat because of warmer climates. But also both these vector-borne diseases and new infectious diseases are associated with forest loss, and they're increasingly affecting people. There have been over $100 billion, in fact, in direct costs to economy in the last 20 years. Alone from novel outbreaks, from disease outbreaks. And that doesn't include COVID. So we can only use our imagination, although there are certainly a handful of increasing scary estimates for the impacts that we're living today with the outbreak of COVID-19. And we're still understanding the exact origins and impacts of COVID, but like HIV, the story of COVID most likely starts with the pace and the sheer volume of our destruction of forests globally. So in recent decades, this is part of a clear trend. Approximately 3 to 4 new infectious diseases have emerged each year. And like I said, the majority of these are zoonotic and they do originate from origin. So this chart in part illustrates the estimated over 30% of past disease outbreaks. These can all be traced back in some way or form to land use change, to the fragmentation of forests. So forest loss has been shown to be the underlying factor and the biggest determinant in predicting risk of outbreaks. And here this is a little digger, a bulldozer to illustrate that each of these outbreaks can be traced back to forest loss. And like I said, we're still looking into exactly the origins of COVID-19, but given its very likely bat origin, bats live in forests, and other outbreaks have been associated with the disruption of bat habitat. And despite that, deforestation is still continuing at much higher levels than we can sustain. 8 football fields every 10 seconds. That is an enormous and unsustainable rate of deforestation, and it's directly correlated, these rates of deforestation, to the rise in infectious disease outbreaks. This particular photo is in an area of Sumatra in Indonesia, which has been devastated by palm oil plantations in particular. And this land clearing has additional impacts on climate change, as 20% of global greenhouse gases do come from this type of deforestation, which compounds the potential impacts of communicable diseases and disease outbreaks. You might remember one of those categories of human health impacts is non-communicable diseases. And those with respiratory or other non-communicable diseases, for example, they can have their health might be exacerbated, their vulnerability increased if they were to come in contact with a communicable disease, both related to deforestation or have indirect relationships to deforestation. So these are the relationships where it's really important to better understand and start talking about them as impacts of forest loss and how we manage our nature. So I did want to just include this this shot of Dr. Fauci. He recently released with a few other co-authors a paper in which they directly highlighted our imbalance with nature as the underlying factor of increased outbreaks. So I am going to just read this. The COVID-19 pandemic is yet another reminder that in a human-dominated world in which our human activities represent aggressive, damaging, and unbalanced interactions with nature, we will increasingly provoke new disease emergences. COVID-19 is among the most vivid wake-up calls in over a century. It should force us to begin to think in earnest and collectively about living in more thoughtful and creative harmony with nature. And I wanted to include that because in a number of ways, it's actually quite remarkable and important to have health professionals, especially a prominent health professional such as Dr. Fauci, to be making these connections. Hearing from a public health professional is really essential because in actuality, there's relatively very little collaboration between public health and conservation professionals to deploy forests to truly prevent future or worsened diseases, and then the inverse, deploy forest natural infrastructure to improve human well-being. One category I didn't have up earlier is mental health and well-being. Mental health significantly increases with exposure to nature, and we've also seen this with COVID, where there's been an increase and influx of people moving out, going into nature as an escape and as a way to help cope with some of the impacts here and manage what we're currently dealing with in managing the current pandemic. So you might have heard the term before, One Health. And it's a term that was coined a few decades ago that meant to get at this crux, meant to get at driving attention to how the environment and people and animal health all interact to affect people, and try to raise the visibility of it. And that's really important. Here I'm sharing what that One Health paradigm looks like, because I think it's really interesting to show the pyramid of interventions that have been mapped out and pursued by One Health. But traditionally, it's really been focused on the literal or exact interactions between humans and wild animals and domestic animals, meaning it's had a strong veterinary lens. And increasingly, One Health professionals are seeing that environmental factors are left out too often of these solutions. Conservation professionals are really underrepresented. And that translates to a disparity in the conversation, to the dialogue, to the kinds of co-created solutions that might be out there. And then as a result, the effectiveness to how we talk about both nature and public health and who we're talking to. And this is really important to start kind of bringing together these conversations. There's really no better place to spotlight how conservation really can and should play a role in supporting these environmental factors that serve as the foundation of the rest of this pyramid. There's no better place to spotlight that relationship and promising solutions than the island of Borneo in Sabah, Malaysia. So I'm going to take us there next. This is where Sabah is. It currently produces around 10% of the world's palm oil, and it has some of the last remaining habitat for orangutan and Borneo elephants. It's also no stranger to both deforestation, but also significant health impacts. Malaysia experienced a Nipah outbreak. Nipah is a pretty deadly infectious disease that was associated with deforestation following burning, clearing of forests. Bats were uprooted and they were pushed into nearby mango fruit farms. Their original fruit source within the forest trees were now gone. And they spent a lot of time then roosting in these farms where they fed on mangoes that then dropped and were eaten by pigs. And that proximity to humans led to these outbreaks. Similarly, another zoonotic disease, malaria, endemic in most of the world. In this part of the world, Sabah is considered ground zero for a new kind of malaria that's associated with forest loss. And the increased interaction between people and certain kinds of monkeys that are found to be carrying this new strain of malaria, and haze with increases in clearing in Malaysia, but also neighboring Indonesia. Haze from the fires exacerbates respiratory illnesses, which in turn exacerbates most other potential health impacts. These things are interacting to make things worse, and there have been quite literally thousands of deaths from the haze from clearings. So Sabah is no stranger to the relationship between deforestation and health, and this is what it looks like on the ground. You can see in the forefront, this is oil palm development. There's been cleared. There's some new plantings here in the very forefront left where the elephant is now walking through. And in the background, this is pristine forest. This is beautiful natural forest. It's actually a reserve where you have these palm oil plantations go right up against the reserves. It's kind of zoned out to the max here in the state of Sabah. And a lot of this pristine forest has been logged and planted over, but we're seeing that the forest will come back if we let it. And so WWF is working really closely with government, with companies to save that remaining forest, and really switch that that narrative of the relationship between deforestation and the negative health impacts that have occurred in Sabah thus far, and tell that story a little better, because thus far, again, those working in public health, those working in conservation, we haven't been working as closely together as we could be, even though we're all striving for those same goals. So WWF is working to produce better, ensure that the production of these oil palm plantations, palm oil is one of the most prevalent forms of oil in products that all of us use. So let's produce much better. Let's commit to ensuring that that doesn't entail further encroachment into forests. And let's restore wildlife corridors, making sure that elephants, like this elephant here that you see, has a clear path to go between this nature reserve that we see here and the one that's out of frame, but just on the other side of this plantation. And then lastly, to protect what's left. So here I have my colleague on the right of the screen, Nick Fong, that's me in the center. And Nick Fong works for WWF Malaysia in Sabah. And on the left is Jamal. He works for this company that we were visiting to really look at where there's the most important areas to set aside and restore corridors for wildlife. And that means looking at where the elephant's already walking, where would it have the most impact to people as well to set aside areas to restore. And let's take a look at land use plans and let's zone better. So this company that my colleague Nick is working with has been doing exactly that. And right now Jamal is showing us both their current mapping plans, but also where they're hoping to set aside additional corridors in the future. And part of this was initially an economic decision. The elephants were tromping through anyway, and the company was losing money because the elephants, they're one of the more adaptable species. So they were just they wanted to get to the other side of that other nature reserve. They're gonna come through, and they were destroying a lot of crops. So while setting aside wildlife corridors is not the cheapest move, it was in fact saving them money. And then on top of that, when you look at all the other benefits that restoration provides, the company started to see actually there's really a lot of value to the broader state goals as well. The state goal of stopping deforestation and the state goals of protection. And so a natural coalition formed that's been in fact growing since. And part of that effort here is to restore those wildlife corridors. So produce better, don't encroach into forests. And then when we set aside those wildlife corridors, this is Ram Nathan. He is a sustainability manager at this company, very proudly standing in front of recent signage that denotes the wildlife corridor here. And again, they set this aside for elephants, but they've seen it as an opportunity to really diversify their company outputs as well, and products and value. And they've started to expand and advertise this as an ecotourism opportunity. And that's an area where they're really leaning into and growing. They have facilities where people can come and stay, and they can go. There's videos throughout the corridor where people want to volunteer and help in restoration. There are tree planting events, and then they can romp through the wildlife corridor, as I did myself, and track elephant prints among others. It's really quite exciting, and they're getting you can tell the pride that this company has in setting aside this wildlife corridor. And it's really important to be more sustainable in the long term, to really take advantage of that range of services. And in Sabah in particular, this is exciting because there's not as much domestic tourism as you might think. There's not a lot of attention to the wealth and biodiversity that exists in Sabah, despite it being one of the most biodiverse places actually in the world. So the role of ecotourism and the opportunities that provide here have been an exciting part of the solutions in making sure Sabah is able to maintain their remaining forests. And here I just wanted to share this cute elephant. romping through a part of the plantation that neighbored the restoration corridor. It was really exciting to see these elephants. And so there's the wildlife corridor set aside, but also the companies recognizes that the elephants like to eat recently cut down older palm trees. So they let the elephants come in and sort of feast on this cut down palm as well. And it's part of that better production. No need to clear when the elephants can come in and do that themselves, and then use that restored wildlife corridor to get in between nature reserve areas. And here I am with another colleague in Tawau Hills National Park. So this is part of the protect efforts in Sabah that are super important to complement the restoration efforts and the efforts to produce much more efficiently and much better to ensure there's no more deforestation. And the park is government run, but it borders multiple plantations. And WWF's been working with ministries that manage parks and wildlife, as well as several different civil society groups and local NGOs to support the state commitment to keeping 30% of the state of Sabah protected. But until now, the Ministry of Health hasn't been directly involved, even though this goal aligns. The goal of protecting 30% of forests and stopping deforestation aligns directly with their goals on minimizing disease outbreaks. They have special units that looks at containing disease outbreaks and implications. So the question is, okay, well, why aren't we working together when forest loss has been a key determinant to future disease outbreaks? And in fact, Sabah has seen that directly with Nipah. So there are several organizations, one called EcoHealth Alliance, also the University of Sabah that's there, and a few others. They've been helping to track this relationship between deforestation and malaria specifically in Sabah and what it's cost the government and companies. And spoiler, it's more money than they're actually making from the plantation. So that fact, you might imagine, really piques their interest. It's not as simple as that. The loss often comes later because it's once people get sick that you start, there's loss of life, which is invaluable. And then there's also costs to loss of labor, and the state itself absorbs the cost of hospital visits. So there's a lot of factors there that just weren't being talked about as part of the impacts, and then potential avoided impacts if we really unite together and effectively stop deforestation further in Sabah and keep the remaining forests protected. So as we ramp up these efforts to protect and to restore and to ensure good production, we also want to be really aware of those numerous health impacts that are part of this package, and to open up new doors to unlikely partners, because until we do that, we're really only telling a part of the story. And so, a part of the story, and I just wanted to stop and kind of underscore that it's mutually beneficial. It's a part of the story of stopping deforestation that we are also helping to prevent future disease impacts, but it's also part of the public health story, that conservation can play a role. And when we design how we support forests, and when we're visiting forests, when we're visiting parks, that is an impact that we should have in mind as well. And it is a key factor to things like land use planning, zoning, where there are communities of people, and how we calculate trade-offs to where we produce food and where we keep forests standing. So all this is really important to tell as really one story. And so here I wanted to share a happy red leaf monkey in the national park. Because again, this national park was really exciting to walk into, and it's what something could look like and should look like, where just less than 100 feet walking in, you have a totally different chorus of sounds, and you have monkeys jumping through the trees. We, on a particular morning, were tracing gibbons. It was all really exciting and hard to believe that we were actually that close to plantations. So with space to jump from tree to tree and to avoid people, therefore minimizing interactions where pathogens and disease might overlap. This is really, it's an important, factor here, and in turn means we also are not increasing the kinds of disease vectors that tend to adapt to fragmented landscapes, because in plantations you're more likely to have pools of water, say, where mosquitoes, the species of mosquitoes that happen to carry malaria like to hang out. And so you have this compounding of benefits here. And this red leaf monkey was a very special sight. So I wanted to make sure to share that with all of us, because we were able to sit and watch them jump from around trees to trees for actually a few hours, which was quite unique. And I wanted to come back to this slide now, back to Kenya, Mfungano Island in Lake Victoria, for a couple reasons. Because as you might or might not infer, we are gearing up for how to tackle this climb. Even though it's one I've done many times, it was never any less daunting. But we did in fact do it. We did it with planning, and we did it with support of one another. And I also wanted to share this beyond that small metaphor, because Mfungano really constantly reminds me of the resilience of people if they have the freedom and the community bonds to act. And that's an important point, because today Mfungano is one of the highest participation rates in what's called voluntary counseling and testing for HIV. And it's not a small feat given the pressures of stigma of disease. So there has been an active effort and embracing of knowing one's HIV status, and talking more openly about it, and working with community members to then address other problems that might have seemed insurmountable. Like if we're clearing forests, if we're using slash and burn, what does it mean for landslides? And then how does that impact our health? So how can we work together to stop deforestation and increase the resilience locally? And they are in progress of doing just that. Numerous communities have joined together there to gazette or to protect the remaining forest cover on these really steep slopes that you're seeing here. And also along all the riverbeds and streams that covered the island but had actually dried up because of the rate of deforestation and fragmentation there. A lot of the river streams, they lost their flow because the trees weren't there to be depositing and holding water into those stream beds. And there are people that live on top of that plateau we're looking at, and they had to start walking all the way down to the lake when they could no longer rely on these streams. So in gazetting these forests, they've taken a really big step in banding together. And to me, this is a full circle story. It's one that can be complex, but I like to tell it because it's really a full circle story with an unfolding of a health disaster associated with deforestation decades ago in Central Africa that made its way to Kenya, but also all the way now to the embracing of forests to strengthen resilience against that very same disease. And forests have shown us that they are our first line of defense against the impacts of disease, against increased outbreaks, against increased expansion of vector-borne diseases like malaria and Lyme disease here in the US. That's also connected to forest degradation increasingly. But they're also one of our last lines of defense, where we rely on forests for our own resilience to those diseases once they do occur as well. So I wanted to end on that note because forests really play a strong role here that we don't often talk about. And it's my goal for us to start making those connections and talk about it as one big package here in our everyday lives when we think about what we can do to support nature and how we enjoy nature when we're in it. So thank you so much for your time and for listening to that full circle story. And I'm going to just turn it over for a second back to Kendall.
Thank you, Annika. That was wonderful. We've got some great questions for you, and I'd like to remind everyone watching, if you have a question for Annika, you can submit those in the control panel under the questions field. All right, first question is just a quick request. Could you please spell the name of the island in Kenya where WWF is involved?
Happily, Mfungano. Two clarifications. One, it's actually not WWF. This was in my prior life, prior to WWF. And the island is Mfungano, M-F-A-N-G-A-N-O, Mfungano Island.
Great, thank you. And someone would like you to, I guess, maybe just give a general summary of why forest loss is related to disease.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's so hard to talk about these connections without really getting into all of the relationships. And the relationships can be quite complicated and numerous. And so that's part of the reason why I didn't want to get kind of sucked down into what can be a technical discussion. But there are multiple ways that forest loss connects to new infectious disease. And those relationships tend to be when you cut down forests, a couple things happen. One, people naturally start to interact more with animals, with wildlife that they might not otherwise interact with. And wildlife have different pathogens circulating around them. Just like there's animal biodiversity, there's also pathogen biodiversity. And their viruses are just circulating within animals. And then when they encounter people and they make the jump to people, it can have a very different reaction in which humans might get much more sicker to a new disease than animal populations. But it's actually also more complicated than simply interacting with species. When you degrade forests, you also upset the balance of the species themselves. So there's lots of different possibilities and relationships between pushing populations of animals closer and closer together. So they might have a circulation of pathogens that amplify more than it otherwise would within a smaller, tighter population, meaning it's easier for those pathogens to then jump over to people. It's also the case that when you have a degraded forest or deforestation, the wildlife that tends to adapt to those forests tend to be wildlife or animals that are better hosts for pathogens and are more likely to come and go between human populations. So rodents, for example, mice, this is the case with Lyme disease in the US, where when you have a degraded forest, mice populations increase, and then the control, the birds of prey, might decrease because they are a bit more sensitive to having healthy forests. So then you have rodents moving in and out between human populations and the forest with less control. And then another way is with vector-borne diseases. So I just gave the Lyme disease example, but also with many different kinds of mosquitoes, you have the consistent relationship between mosquitoes thriving on forest edges or recently deforested areas versus inland to deep forests. And those mosquitoes that tend to thrive are the ones that happen to carry different forms of malaria that then get passed over to people. So it's a combination of kind of upsetting the balance, so you have better conditions for diseases themselves to thrive, but also you just have people that are interacting with those conditions much more.
Okay, got it. And switching gears a little bit, how wide do wildlife corridors need to be in order to be successful?
That's a good question. It totally depends on the wildlife you are accommodating. So in the case of Sabah, Malaysia, which is where WWF is working, I don't remember the exact width, but it's quite wide, but not as wide as you might imagine it would have to be. So let's see, I'm thinking in kilometers, maybe a kilometer wide. And I could certainly follow up with the exact parameters of the Sabah corridor specifically, but that wildlife corridor was specifically set aside and planned for elephants. So looking at what elephants need, but also how to encourage elephants to use it, because they don't have to. They were already going, in between the reserves through the plantation, but they prefer the corridor. But that particular corridor is also being restored for orangutans, which are much more sensitive than elephants. So they require these sort of stepping stones of trees that they can hop between, because they move constantly and they make new nests. They sleep in a different place every time, but they need a certain size of kind of a cluster of trees periodically for them to be able to move and to be encouraged to move between reserves. So that's the case in Saba. And if you were restoring a corridor in another place, you would definitely look at those species. For example, in Colombia, our teams are looking at how to support jaguars in buffer areas around a major national park there. So that looks to what jaguars need, and different species just have different ranges that we would seek to accommodate.
Great. There were quite a few questions on palm oil, so I'm going to run through a few of those. Are palm oil plantations continuing to expand, or is the Indonesian government putting limits on them?
They are still expanding. The state governments are taking different degrees of action. So Sabah is in Malaysia, and the state of Malaysia has committed to no more deforestation and maintaining 30% protected area. So they've mostly set aside their land. Now we're doing what we're doing because we really want to make sure that commitment stays strong, but it is a strong commitment. But other states within Malaysia don't have that same commitment. So in mainland Malaysia, where Kuala Lumpur is, those areas still have expanding plantations, and Indonesia also still has expanding plantations, although they do also have some commitments. So that's why we work really closely with the private sector as well, because companies do have a lot of pull themselves in really maintaining, making, and enforcing their own commitments. It's definitely a really important part, and it's why it's really important for consumers to express our desire to companies that they not be deforesting.
Great. And how does one define sustainable palm oil?
Yeah, such good questions. Palm oil is a really interesting oil. It is actually very efficient as an oil and as a fruit and as a plant, meaning you need less land to produce more oil than other oils that might be used in these same products. So as a standalone, it's an efficient product, but we also need to look for ways to be producing less, because there's just not enough land area to make all the palm oil to meet all the demand that's out there for sort of this uncapped trajectory. So sustainable palm oil, it might mean different things locally, but really it means being able to produce an amount of palm oil without encroaching or compromising the surrounding ecosystem services that exist of forests or of other ecosystems that might be there. In the case of palm oil, it's replacing forests. There are always trade-offs in production. There are trade-offs when we produce our food at large scales, at small scales. So that's why when I talk about kind of telling this broader story of public health and conservation, it's because when we say we're going to plant more palm oil, it's for, say, livelihoods or for products that might also be supportive of people's well-being. But that comes at an expense. And so sustainable palm oil and sustainability in other products would take into consideration this range of effects and impacts, and then plan accordingly.
And can you explain a little bit more about WWF's role in promoting environmentally friendly methods of producing palm oil?
Sure. So WWF, we are in over 100 countries, and several of those countries are, numerous of those countries actually are producer countries for a range of commodities that affect forests, not just palm oil. But when we work in those countries, we take a similar approach that we're doing in Sabah, where we encourage and work very closely with governments to ensure a certain amount of protection, but also working closely with the private sector for them to understand their impact on forest resources, to not be deforesting. There is still too much deforestation happening. Deforestation is still on the rise in a number of really important places, and that's not okay. And as we've seen and learned, it's increasingly impacting people globally, like a spillover event, COVID. Now we're in a global pandemic. So we work with companies to make those deforestation-free commitments. That's really essential to have that active and vocal and transparent commitment, and to then integrate that into their own policies and practices. And we do a lot of work on the ground with those companies to help them with their land use planning, so zoning. I had that photo, for example, of myself and my colleague Nick working with a company representative on where they've set aside a wildlife corridor. That was a lot of conversation and work that led up to designating that area as a wildlife corridor. Also looking at a range of labor practices, pesticide use, and for a lot of commodities, there are standards and certification to make sure that there is a consistent level of rigor and a consistent level of production that's happening. A lot of these are voluntary. So for palm oil, there's something called RSPO, Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. Sometimes you can see RSPO on products. And for forest products, you might see FSC, Forest Stewardship Council certification. WWF works really closely with companies to pursue what we view as the most rigorous available standards out there for production. And those standards include things that say no more deforestation. So if a company has that, they're also not deforesting, which is really critical. And it's really important to have that standardized system so that companies are abiding by and looking for integrating how to produce in a way that doesn't compromise nature and supports wildlife to the best of their ability. And we work in other countries working with policymakers and government to make sure that we start standardizing, in legislation, not importing illegal timber or products that come from illegal deforestation to produce palm oil, for example. So we work closely, and we have colleagues working closely in the UK with government, the EU, and here in the US, looking to explore how we can make things more standard so that consumers, everyday consumers, aren't having to make all the choices themselves. Because right now, a lot of the burden is on everyday consumers, and that's important, but not very fair or sustainable in the long term. So we really do the full range of coordination there.
Mm-hmm. Now, are there alternatives to palm oil that are better for the planet?
So that gets back to my point on palm oil being pretty efficient. What we really need to do is think about how to consume less, and that's to be more sustainable. That's really important, because there might not necessarily be an alternative oil that is more sustainable, especially if we're not addressing the big picture. Because if we say, okay, we're not going to have any more of this product, but we are going to instead move to another product because we think it's not contributing to deforestation, well, companies and governments might respond and start deforesting for that new product. So it's really important that we actually look at the big picture with forests in the center and say, okay, how much forest do we need and why do we need them? They benefit public health. Are we public health advocates? And are there public health advocates that can be more vocal about really making sure we keep a certain amount of forests intact or protected? And that doesn't have to mean formal protection. That means working with communities to manage their own land and to benefit from forests more explicitly. And then from there, looking at, okay, now that we have forests at the center, we agree to conserve our nature. We're going to support nature by visiting these beautiful places and reward them staying intact. Now let's look at what are our additional needs and where and how we can best produce to feed ourselves or to produce products that are in demand. So I'm answering by saying, you know, it's for the long term, we really have to kind of look at the inverse. Let's look at keeping forests and how much forests we need, and then using that to inform our decisions around production and consumption.
Okay. Okay, going back to the corridors, what are some of the techniques used to encourage wildlife to use them?
Well, thus far, I can tell you in Sabah that wildlife want corridors. So if they're there, they will use them. So it doesn't necessarily take a whole lot of incentivizing other than setting them aside. There are certain things that goes into planning for the restoration of corridors, certainly prioritizing planting native species, but also in the case of Sabah, you know, planting elephant apple, for example. It's called that because it's a species of fruit tree that's native and that elephants are known to like. So fruit trees that we know, you know, wildlife might rely on for food, making sure that's among the mix of species planted throughout a corridor. And like I said, in the case of orangutan, making sure they have those stepping stones, making sure the right cluster of trees are there at the right spacing so that orangutan are more likely to use them to get from one reserve to another. So it's kind of knowing what they like, making sure it's there, but also you'd be surprised at how quickly wildlife will catch on because they really want that extra space, and they'll react accordingly for the most part.
And there's some interest in your thoughts on the wildfires in the US, so I'm going to combine a couple questions for you. What is the risk of new disease from all the forest fires that are going on in the US right now? And what are your thoughts on forest management and the fires happening in the West?
So for forests, the forest fires and new disease, when you have forest loss, you are increasing the risk of disease. So in the case of the US, you know, right now, a lot of it is from fires. You're also contributing to degradation of the landscape, which means you might have some of those species that are more adapted to a broader range of environments like rodents. They might increase because they're not going to be as pushed out, and they might be first to come back after there are fires, and they're more likely to host disease. At the same time, what I've found really interesting about the fires out west is hearing from public health professionals, hearing from nurses and doctors that actually there has been an increase in negative health outcomes from a fungus that came from spores that were in the soil, that because of the amount of fire that occurred, you had a sudden release of these spores going into the air, and then you had an unprecedented spread of this fungus that was affecting people. And health professionals didn't really know what to do about that because they weren't accustomed to, nor did they necessarily know at the time that, oh wait, this is coming from, you know, a sudden release in the soil because of degradation of the forest. So in the case of the fires, there are other health impacts that have shown to increase beyond just disease. And then in terms of the forest management practices, there's a long history in the U.S. of varied kinds of forest management practices, and it is true over the last several decades, historically in the last half century, there were forest management practices that suppressed the natural forest regime, and that has led to an increase in buildup of burnable biomass that shouldn't necessarily be there because it would have burned away with the natural forest cycles. That said, the forest management practices have generally corrected. There are still quite a lot of large scale clear cuts that do occur out west that aim to mimic what a fire would do. but they can't mimic it exactly because there are a lot of species that of trees that actually rely on the heat, for example, from a fire to reproduce. You know, heat causes a pine cone to burst and then the seeds disperse. You don't have that without the heat from the fire. So forest management might try to mimic that, but not always successful. And now we are seeing, you know, we're seeing impacts from a longer history of not allowing those natural fires to burn. So in future, I think that is something that'll be really important, is to adapt with allowing for controlled burns to occur. But there's a lot of other factors that are happening right now with the U.S. forests that'll all have to be considered.
Okay. Well, it is just about the top of the hour, Annika, so I would like to hand it back over to you for some closing comments.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. And I hope one thing you'll take away today really is that when we talk about nature and we talk about forests, we are really talking about ourselves. And it's a bit of a hill, you know, rebuilding back from COVID, but it really does present a unique opportunity for our lifetime to start correcting and adjusting how we live our lives day to day and what we expect from companies and from governments. And so I hope you found this interesting, and I hope you've left today thinking, okay, you know what, forests are part of the repertoire, part of our arsenal, a really critical part of our arsenal against disease and in ensuring we are all healthy. And that's just a really critical message for today. And I hope you'll tell your friends.
Thank you so much, Annika. It was such a pleasure to have you today, and this was absolutely fascinating. So I really appreciate your time. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have a replay available on our website soon. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.